They laughed when she missed the bullseye at the community shooting range, calling her just another washed-up veteran trying to relive her glory days. But when a single gunshot echoed through the facility and smoke cleared, it was her precision that had just saved General Morrison's life from an assassin's bullet. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maggie Chen stood at Lane 7 of the Riverside Community Shooting Range, her weathered hands gripping a basic rental pistol that had seen better days. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet resignation of someone who had learned to expect little from the world and even less from the people in it. Her graying black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded flannel shirt over worn jeans, the kind of outfit that made her blend seamlessly into any crowd. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the fine lines around her eyes and the small scar that ran along her left temple, a barely visible reminder of a past she rarely spoke about. The Saturday afternoon crowd at Riverside was typical for a weekend, a mix of weekend warriors, hunting enthusiasts, and casual shooters looking to blow off steam. Most were middle-aged men who spoke in loud voices about their latest purchases and debated the merits of different ammunition brands with the confidence of armchair experts. They treated the range like their personal clubhouse, a place where they could feel powerful and important, surrounded by the tools of their hobby and the camaraderie of like-minded individuals. Maggie had been coming to Riverside for 3 months now, ever since she'd moved to the small town of Millbrook after her latest job at the hardware store had ended. She always paid for an hour, rented the same basic Glock 19, and methodically worked through a box of standard target ammunition. Her routine was predictable and unremarkable, just another regular customer who kept to herself and never caused any trouble. The range staff knew her name only because it was on the rental form, and her interactions with other shooters were limited to polite nods and the occasional "excuse me" when someone needed to pass behind her station. What made Maggie different wasn't immediately apparent to the casual observer. She didn't wear military unit pins or veterans' baseball caps. She didn't share war stories or name-drop her service record. There were no patches on her jacket or bumper stickers on her aging Honda Civic that proclaimed her veteran status. She had deliberately chosen anonymity, finding peace in the simple act of being overlooked and underestimated. The only hints of her past were subtle, visible only to those who knew what to look for: the way she automatically scanned every room upon entering, the unconscious habit of keeping her back to walls, and the measured way she moved, as if every step was calculated and purposeful. The other regulars at Riverside had formed their own opinions about the quiet woman in Lane 7. To them, she was just another casualty of modern times, probably laid off from some factory job, and trying to feel tough by playing with guns. They whispered among themselves about her inconsistent shooting, how she seemed to struggle with basic marksmanship, missing targets that any decent shooter should hit easily. What they didn't realize was that Maggie was deliberately shooting poorly, instinctively dulling her skills to match the expectations of her environment. Tommy Brennan, a local plumbing contractor who fancied himself the unofficial king of Riverside, was particularly vocal in his assessment of Maggie's abilities. A large man with a beer belly and a tendency to speak louder than necessary, Tommy had been shooting at the range for 15 years and considered himself an expert on firearms and the people who used them. He would often make comments within earshot about weekend warriors and people who had no business handling weapons, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from being a big fish in a small pond. "Look at her," Tommy would say to his drinking buddies, Brad and Kenny, as they watched Maggie practice from their favored spots near the range entrance. 3 months and she still can't hit the broad side of a barn. Probably some desk jockey who thinks watching action movies makes her Annie Oakley. His companions would chuckle and nod. secure in their own superior abilities and comfortable in the knowledge that they were part of the inner circle at Riverside. The mockery wasn't limited to Tommy's group. Other shooters would shake their heads when they saw Maggie's targets, the paper marked with scattered holes that seemed to have no pattern or purpose. Some made jokes about participation trophies and lowered standards, their comments delivered with the casual cruelty of people who believed they were punching down at someone who couldn't fight back. They saw her quiet demeanor as weakness, her reluctance to engage in their boastful conversations as evidence of insecurity about her abilities. What none of them knew was that Maggie Chen had spent 12 years in the Army, with 6 of those years in specialized units that most people had never heard of and wouldn't believe existed if they had. She had been trained by the best marksmen in the world, had fired weapons that weren't available to civilians, and had developed skills that were measured not in bullseyes on paper targets, but in lives saved and missions accomplished. Her muscle memory was programmed for precision that went far beyond anything required at a civilian shooting range, and her understanding of ballistics, wind compensation, and stress shooting was the kind that came from real-world application under the most demanding circumstances possible. But that was a different life, one that existed in classified files and memories that she worked hard to keep buried. The woman who had once been Staff Sergeant Margaret Chen, decorated marksman and instructor at the Army's elite sniper school, had chosen to become simply Maggie, a middle-aged woman who rented guns at a community range and deliberately missed shots that she could have made with her eyes closed. She had her reasons for this deception, reasons that went deeper than simple humility or a desire for privacy. The transition from military to civilian life had been harder than she'd expected. The structured environment of the Army, with its clear hierarchy and defined missions, had been replaced by the chaotic uncertainty of civilian employment and the challenge of finding meaning in work that felt trivial compared to what she'd done in uniform. She had tried various jobs, from security work to teaching, but nothing had felt right. The skills that had made her invaluable in the military seemed almost useless in the civilian world, and she had gradually learned to hide her capabilities, to avoid the uncomfortable questions and the skepticism that often greeted women who claimed to have served in combat roles. The shooting range had become her compromise, a place where she could maintain some connection to her past while staying safely anonymous. The deliberate poor shooting was a form of camouflage, a way to blend in with the crowd and avoid the kind of attention that came with displaying exceptional abilities. She had learned through painful experience that being too good at something, especially something traditionally associated with men, often led to challenges, tests, and the kind of scrutiny that she no longer wanted to endure. As she loaded another magazine and took her position at the firing line, Maggie could hear the familiar sounds of the range around her, the sharp crack of firearms, the mechanical whir of target systems, and the constant undercurrent of conversation from the other shooters. She had become part of the background noise of Riverside, just another regular customer who posed no threat to anyone's ego or sense of superiority. It was exactly what she wanted, a perfect disguise that allowed her to practice her passion without revealing her true nature. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very people who mocked her abilities were the ones who felt most comfortable around her. Their condescension was actually a form of acceptance, proof that her disguise was working perfectly. They saw what they expected to see, a woman out of her element, trying to participate in their world without the skills or knowledge to truly belong. It was a role she had learned to play with convincing authenticity, right down to the slightly uncertain way she held her weapon and the hesitant questions she would occasionally ask about basic shooting techniques. The ridicule had started almost immediately after Maggie's first visit to Riverside. She remembered walking into the range that first Saturday afternoon, signing the waiver with careful handwriting, and approaching the rental counter with the kind of nervous energy that suggested unfamiliarity with the process. The young clerk, A college student named Derek, who worked weekends to pay for his automotive program, had been helpful enough, explaining the basic safety rules and showing her how to load the magazine. But even then, she could feel the eyes of the other shooters on her, assessing and categorizing her before she'd even fired her first shot. The initial mockery had been subtle, the kind of sideways glances and whispered comments that people made when they thought they were being discreet. Tommy Brennan had been the first to make his feelings known, though not directly to her face. "Great," she'd heard him mutter to Brad as they watched her struggle with the electronic target system. "Another tourist who thinks shooting is like the movies." The comment had been loud enough for her to hear, which was clearly the intention, but indirect enough to maintain plausible deniability. As the weeks passed, the mockery had become more open and more creative. The regulars had developed a repertoire of jokes and observations about her shooting that they shared with anyone who would listen. They critiqued her stance, commenting on how she held the pistol like it was going to bite her. They made fun of her targets, comparing her scattered shot patterns to abstract art or suggesting she might be aiming for a different target entirely. The humor was always delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that men often reserved for women who dared to enter their traditional spaces. General Morrison, a retired mechanic who spent most of his pension at the range, had developed a particular fondness for theatrical displays of superior knowledge. Whenever Maggie was within earshot, he would launch into detailed explanations about proper shooting technique, speaking in the loud, condescending tone that people used when they wanted to educate someone they considered inferior. "You see," he would say to his companions while gesturing toward her lane, "the problem with most beginners is they don't understand the fundamentals. Breath control, sight alignment, trigger squeeze, it's all connected. But some people think they can just point and shoot like in the movies." The range staff had initially tried to be helpful, offering unsolicited advice and suggesting she might benefit from taking a basic marksmanship course. Derek had rented a local instructor who specialized in working with nervous beginners, and the range manager, a former police officer named Carl Stevens, had even offered to give her some free pointers during slow periods. Their intentions were good, but their assumptions about her skill level were based on what they saw at the firing line, not on any understanding of her actual capabilities. Maggie had accepted their advice with appropriate gratitude, nodding along as they explained concepts she had been teaching to military personnel for years. She asked the right questions, expressed the right concerns, and generally played the role of the eager but struggling student. It was a performance that required considerable self-control, especially when the advice being offered was technically incorrect or based on outdated information. More than once, she had to bite her tongue to keep from correcting misconceptions about ballistics or pointing out flaws in the recommended shooting techniques the other women who occasionally visited. The range seemed to view her with a mixture of sympathy and embarrassment. They understood the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated environment, but they also seemed to feel that her poor performance reflected badly on all of them. A few had tried to offer encouragement or share their own experiences, but these interactions were always brief and somewhat awkward. It was clear that they saw her as a cautionary tale, an example of what happened when someone stepped outside their comfort zone without proper preparation. That the mockery wasn't limited to her shooting ability. The regulars had also developed opinions about her background, her reasons for being at the range, and her general fitness for gun ownership. They speculated about her personal life, creating elaborate backstories that explained her presence at Riverside. Some suggested she was recently divorced and trying to feel empowered. Others theorized that she'd been the victim of a crime and was attempting to learn self-defense. The most creative theory, proposed by Tommy after a few beers, was that she was having a midlife crisis and had decided to try everything she'd never done before. These conversations always took place within her hearing range, which was clearly intentional. The men seemed to enjoy the idea that she was listening to their analysis of her life and motivations. It was a form of psychological dominance, a way of establishing that she was not just a poor shooter, but also a source of entertainment for their amusement. They treated her like a character in a story they were writing, rather than a real person with her own thoughts and feelings. The pattern of mockery had become so predictable that Maggie could anticipate the comments before they were made. When she had a particularly bad day at the range, deliberately clustering her shots in the outer rings of the target, she knew that Tommy would make some comment about spray and pray techniques. When she asked Derek about different types of ammunition, she could count on Kenny to launch into a lecture about ballistics that would be equal parts condescending and incorrect. The routine had become almost comforting in its predictability, a reliable source of cover for her true identity. What made the situation particularly ironic was that many of the men who mocked her shooting were not particularly skilled themselves. Tommy, for all his bluster, was a mediocre shot who compensated for his lack of precision with expensive equipment and loud opinions. Brad had a tendency to flinch when he fired, pulling his shots low and to the left, but he blamed his poor performance on the range's lighting or the quality of the ammunition. Kenny's knowledge was largely theoretical, gleaned from gun magazines and internet forums rather than practical experience, and his shooting reflected this shallow understanding. The range had become a social club where actual marksmanship was less important than the appearance of expertise and the ability to fit in with the established hierarchy. The men who gathered there were seeking validation and camaraderie, not genuine improvement in their shooting skills. They had created an environment where being accepted was more valuable than being accurate, where the right opinions mattered more than the right techniques. Maggie had observed this dynamic with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. She understood that the mockery she endured was not really about her shooting ability, but about maintaining the social order of their little community. By positioning her as the outsider who didn't belong, they reinforced their own sense of belonging and competence. She was the necessary foil that made their own modest abilities seem impressive by comparison. The psychological aspect of her deception had been one of the most challenging elements to master. Deliberately performing poorly at something she excelled at required a different kind of discipline than she'd ever developed in the military. In the Army, the goal had always been excellence, pushing beyond perceived limitations to achieve superior results. At Riverside, she had to constantly hold herself back, suppressing instincts that had been honed through years of training and real-world application. The physical aspects of poor shooting were surprisingly difficult to maintain consistently. Her muscle memory fought against the deliberate mistakes she was making, and she had to consciously force herself to use improper techniques. Holding the pistol with a loose grip felt wrong. Failing to line up the sights properly required conscious effort, and jerking the trigger instead of squeezing it smoothly went against everything she'd been taught. It was like trying to walk with a limp when your legs were perfectly healthy, an unnatural performance that required constant attention to maintain. The disruption came on a humid Thursday evening in late August, when the usual crowd at Riverside was smaller than normal. Most of the regulars were there, along with a few faces that Maggie didn't recognize, but the atmosphere felt different somehow, charged with an energy that she couldn't quite identify. She had claimed her usual spot at Lane 7 and was going through her familiar routine when Derek approached her station with an unusual expression on his face. "Hey Maggie," he said, his voice carrying a note of excitement that was uncommon for the typically laid-back college student. "I wanted to let you know that we're going to have some special visitors here tonight. There's going to be a demonstration by some military folks, and the range manager thought you might want to stick around to watch." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's not every day we get to see real professionals in action." Maggie looked up from loading her magazine, her expression showing polite interest while her mind immediately went into analytical mode. Military demonstrations at civilian ranges were unusual, typically reserved for recruiting events or public relations efforts. The timing felt significant, though she couldn't immediately identify why. "What kind of demonstration?" she asked, keeping her voice casual despite the sudden alertness that had triggered in her nervous system. Derek glanced around the range before leaning slightly closer, his excitement evident. "Word is it's some kind of VIP visit. General Morrison from the State National Guard is supposed to show up with his security detail. They're going to do a marksmanship exhibition, show us civilians how it's really done." He grinned, seemingly oblivious to any potential security implications. "Should be pretty cool to watch. Maybe you'll pick up some tips." The name Morrison triggered a memory that Maggie quickly suppressed, focusing instead on the immediate implications of what Derek had told her. A general visiting a civilian range with a security detail suggested either a planned public relations event or something more significant that required the appearance of normalcy. Either way, it represented a deviation from the predictable routine that had become her refuge at Riverside. As Derek walked away to prepare the range for the visitors, Maggie found herself automatically shifting into a different mode of awareness. Her eyes began tracking the positions of other shooters, noting exit routes and potential cover positions. Her hands, which had been deliberately clumsy with the rental pistol, suddenly felt more natural and controlled. The transformation was subtle but complete. Like a switch being flipped in her nervous system, Tommy Brennan had overheard Derek's announcement and was already holding court near the entrance, his voice carrying across the range as he shared his opinions about military marksmanship with anyone who would listen. "About time we got to see how the real professionals do it," he was saying, his chest puffed out with reflected pride. "These weekend warriors around here could learn a thing or two about proper shooting technique." Kenny Morrison had joined the conversation, and Maggie noticed him straightening his posture and adjusting his veteran's baseball cap, preparing to bask in the reflected glory of the visiting military personnel. "I remember when I was in the service," he began, launching into a familiar story that Maggie had heard variations of several times before. "We had standards back then. Not like these participation trophy kids they're turning out nowadays." The irony of their enthusiasm wasn't lost on Maggie, who continued her practice session while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations around her. These men, who had spent months mocking her abilities, were now positioning themselves as experts who could appreciate and evaluate genuine military marksmanship. They seemed completely unaware of the contradiction between their dismissal of her capabilities and their eagerness to be associated with professional soldiers. As the afternoon wore on, the anticipation in the range began to build. Carl Stevens, the range manager, emerged from his office wearing his best shirt and began making preparations that suggested the visit was more significant than a simple demonstration. He checked the ventilation system, tested the target retrieval mechanisms, and even swept the brass casings from the floor, something that typically happened only at the end of the day. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when two unmarked sedans pulled into the parking lot, their occupants remaining seated while they surveyed the area. Maggie caught a glimpse of them through the range's windows and immediately recognized the controlled alertness of professional security personnel. Their positioning and behavior patterns were textbook examples of advanced team protocols, suggesting that General Morrison's visit was being taken seriously by someone with proper training. Derek had positioned himself near the entrance, clearly excited about the opportunity to meet real military personnel. His enthusiasm was infectious, and even some of the more cynical regulars seemed caught up in the anticipation. Brad had actually cleaned his shooting glasses, and Tommy had changed into a shirt that didn't have obvious stains on it. The transformation of the usually casual range into something approaching a formal venue was both amusing and telling. When the general's party finally arrived, the change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. General Morrison was exactly What central casting would have ordered for a senior military officer? Tall, distinguished, with silver hair, and the kind of bearing that commanded respect without effort. He was accompanied by a small entourage that included what appeared to be junior officers and at least 3 individuals, who were clearly part of his security detail. The security personnel moved with the fluid professionalism that Maggie recognized. Immediately, their eyes constantly scanning the environment while maintaining the appearance of casual alertness. They positioned themselves at strategic locations throughout the range, creating overlapping fields of observation that covered all potential threat vectors. Their clothes were civilian, but their bearing and positioning were unmistakably military. Carl. Stevens stepped forward to greet the general, his handshake firm and his posture unconsciously straightening in the presence of such obvious authority. General Morrison, welcome to Riverside Community Range. We're honored to have you here, sir. His voice carried the kind of respect that was typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. Though Maggie suspected he was also nervous about making a good impression, the general's response was gracious but brief, the kind of polite acknowledgement that senior officers perfected through years of public appearances. Thank you for accommodating us on short notice, Mr. Stevens. I understand you run an excellent facility here. His eyes swept the range, taking in the layout and the assembled shooters with the automatic assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating tactical environments. Tommy Brennan had positioned himself near the general's party, clearly hoping for an opportunity to engage in conversation. His body language suggested barely contained excitement, like a fan hoping to meet a celebrity. Kenny Morrison had done the same, though his approach was more subtle, positioning himself where he could overhear any conversations that might develop. Demonstration itself was impressive by civilian standards, though Maggie recognized that it was more about public relations than genuine marksmanship excellence. The general's security detail took turns at the firing line, producing tight groups at various distances while maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that civilian shooters found intimidating. Their techniques were solid if unremarkable, the kind of competent shooting that met military standards without venturing into the realm of true expertise. What struck Maggie most about the demonstration was how it highlighted the gap between the regulars' perception of their own abilities and the reality of professional marksmanship. The security personnel were clearly skilled, but they were also clearly not specialists in precision shooting. Their focus was on practical accuracy under stress, not the kind of surgical precision that characterized elite marksmanship units. As the demonstration continued, Maggie found herself studying the security team's positioning and protocols with professional interest. Their techniques were competent but predictable, following standard protective detail procedures that would be adequate for most threats, but vulnerable to anyone with specialized training in countering such measures. It was an academic observation, the kind of tactical analysis that had become second nature during her years in specialized units. The general himself participated in the demonstration, producing respectable groups at moderate distances while maintaining the kind of casual competence that senior officers cultivated. His shooting was solid but not exceptional, exactly what one would expect from someone whose primary responsibilities were administrative rather than operational. The civilian shooters watched with obvious admiration, clearly impressed by what they interpreted as superior skill. The electronic systems at Riverside had always been basic but functional, designed more for convenience than security. The range used a simple computerized target system that allowed shooters to adjust distances and track their scores, along with a basic surveillance setup that Carl Stevens had installed primarily to monitor safety violations and resolve disputes. About scoring. The cameras were older models, positioned to cover the firing line and entrance, but they weren't connected to any sophisticated monitoring network. When the general's security detail had arrived, one of the first things they'd done was conduct a sweep of the facility's electronic infrastructure. It was standard protocol for any location where a high-ranking military officer would be spending time. But at Riverside, the process had been almost perfunctory. The range's systems were so basic that they posed minimal security risks, and the team had cleared them quickly before focusing on more traditional physical security measures. What none of them realized was that Maggie's presence at the range had already triggered alerts in systems far more sophisticated than anything Riverside possessed. 3 months earlier, when she'd first filled out the rental agreement and provided her driver's license for verification, that information had been processed through routine background check databases. On the surface, everything had appeared normal. Margaret Chen, 42 years old, no criminal record, valid identification, and nothing to suggest she was anything other than an ordinary citizen interested in recreational shooting. But buried deeper in the digital infrastructure that connected various government databases was a different kind of system, one designed to flag individuals whose backgrounds contained classified information that had been deliberately obscured. When Maggie's name had entered the system, it had triggered a series of automated queries that reached into databases most people didn't know existed. The queries had returned carefully crafted responses that painted the picture of an unremarkable civilian, but they had also generated notification flags that were forwarded to monitoring stations operated by agencies that specialized in tracking former personnel from sensitive military units. The notification hadn't triggered any immediate action because Maggie's file indicated she was living quietly as a civilian and posed no apparent security risk. Her activities at the shooting range were consistent with those of a recreational shooter, and her deliberately poor performance had actually reinforced the assessment that she was no longer operationally capable. The monitoring system had classified her as a low priority subject requiring only passive observation. That classification changed the moment General Morrison's name appeared on the visitor log for Riverside Community Range. The same automated systems that had been passively tracking Maggie's activities suddenly escalated her priority level, not because she posed a threat, but because her presence in the same location as a high-ranking military officer created what the algorithms identified as a convergence event requiring enhanced monitoring. In a secure facility 300 miles away, Senior Analyst David Park was reviewing the automated alert that had appeared on his workstation. The notification was one of dozens that crossed his desk every day, most of which turned out to be false positives or routine coincidences that the monitoring systems flagged out of an abundance of caution. But something about this particular alert caught his attention, partly because of the unusual classification codes attached to the subject's file. Park had been working in signals intelligence for 8 years, and he'd developed an instinct for identifying the alerts that actually mattered. The Maggie Chen file was heavily redacted, even at his clearance level, which suggested involvement in operations that were classified well above routine military activities. The fact that her current activities were being monitored at all indicated that someone, somewhere, considered her significant enough to track. The convergence with General Morrison added another layer of complexity to the situation. Morrison wasn't just any general. He was the state's senior National Guard commander and a key figure in several ongoing defense initiatives. His public appearances were typically coordinated through proper security channels. But the visit to Riverside seemed to have been arranged with minimal advance notice and lighter security protocols than usual. Park pulled up the surveillance feeds from Riverside, which the security team had linked into the monitoring network as a routine precaution. The images showed the general's demonstration proceeding normally, with the civilian shooters watching respectfully from the sidelines. He could see Maggie Chen at lane 7, maintaining her usual position and apparently paying minimal attention to the activities around her. But Park's trained eye noticed subtleties that wouldn't have been apparent to casual observers. Despite her apparent disinterest, Chun's positioning allowed her to monitor both the demonstration and the security team's deployment patterns. Her body language suggested a level of situational awareness that was inconsistent with her file's description of a recreational shooter. Most tellingly, her reaction times to sudden movements around the range were faster than those of the civilians around her, suggesting reflexes that had been trained rather than casual. The discrepancy between Chun's apparent capabilities and her documented performance at the range triggered Park's analytical instincts. He began pulling up additional data streams, looking for patterns that might explain the contradiction. The range's electronic scoring system showed consistently poor performance over 3 months, but the data points were too consistent, lacking the natural variation that characterized genuine learning curves. Meanwhile, at Riverside, the demonstration was winding down, and General Morrison was preparing to tour the rest of the facility. His security detail maintained their professional alertness, but the routine nature of the event had lulled them into a comfortable rhythm. The civilian shooters were clearly enjoying the opportunity to interact with military personnel, and several had engaged the general in conversations about their own service experiences or their enthusiasm for the Second Amendment. Tommy Brennan had managed to position himself for a handshake with the general, pumping Morrison's hand with obvious pride while launching into a monologue about his respect for military service. Kenny Morrison had followed suit, his chest puffed out as he mentioned his own veteran status and his commitment to supporting current military personnel. The general responded with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to such interactions. Showing appropriate interest while maintaining professional distance, Carl Stevens was clearly pleased with how the visit was proceeding, and he'd begun discussing the possibility of making such demonstrations a regular feature at Riverside. The general seemed receptive to the idea, mentioning the National Guard's commitment to community outreach and the importance of maintaining connections between military and civilian communities. What none of them realized was that the routine nature of the visit had created exactly the kind of environment that professional security personnel were trained to watch for. The combination of reduced alertness, predictable patterns, and civilian distractions created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone with the training to recognize and capitalize on them. The first sign that something was wrong came not from the security team or the monitoring systems, but from Maggie's subconscious threat assessment protocols that had been operating in the background throughout the demonstration. Years of training had programmed her to continuously evaluate her environment for potential dangers, and that evaluation process had detected an anomaly that her conscious mind hadn't yet identified. The anomaly was subtle, a slight change in the acoustic signature of the range that suggested movement in areas where no movement should be occurring. The ventilation system's background hum had shifted slightly, indicating that access panels or ductwork might have been disturbed. Most people would have dismissed such minor changes as irrelevant, but Maggie's training had taught her that small environmental shifts often preceded larger threats. Her eyes began tracking the security team's positions more carefully, noting their patterns and identifying potential blind spots in their coverage. Without appearing to do so, she started cataloging the positions of all personnel in the range and mentally mapping escape routes and defensive positions. The transformation was invisible to casual observers, but her level of readiness had shifted. From passive awareness to active assessment, the shift in General Morrison's demeanor was almost imperceptible, but Maggie caught it immediately. During his conversation with Carl Stevens about future community outreach programs, the general's aide had approached and whispered something in his ear. Morrison's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly and his eyes performed a quick sweep of the range that was more tactical than casual. Whatever message he'd received had elevated his alert level, though he was doing an admirable job of maintaining his public facade. The aide who had delivered the message was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Webb, a communications specialist who had been managing the general's schedule and security coordination. She carried a small encrypted communication device that had been buzzing intermittently throughout the demonstration. But this particular message had clearly carried more weight than routine administrative updates. Her own body language had shifted, subtly, suggesting that whatever information she'd received was significant enough to warrant immediate attention. The general security detail had also noticed the change in their principal's demeanor, and their own alertness levels increased. Accordingly, the shift was professional and controlled, barely visible to untrained observers. But Maggie recognized the signs of a protective detail, moving from routine surveillance to heightened readiness. Their positioning became more deliberate, their scam patterns more systematic, and their communication more frequent. From her position at Lane 7, Maggie could observe these changes without appearing to pay attention to anything other than her shooting practice. She had loaded a fresh magazine and was going through the motions of preparing for another series of shots, but her primary focus was on the evolving tactical situation around her. The environmental anomaly she detected earlier was becoming more pronounced, and she was beginning to identify specific areas where the acoustic signature suggested unauthorized activity. The ventilation system's altered sound pattern was now clearly indicating movement in the building's ceiling space, following a path that would provide access to multiple locations within the range. More concerning was the subtle vibration in the floor that suggested someone was moving through the basement utility areas, which shouldn't have been accessible to anyone without Carl Stevens' direct authorization. The combination of overhead and underground movement suggested a coordinated approach that was far beyond what casual intruders would attempt. David Park, monitoring the situation from his remote facility, had escalated the alert to his supervisor after identifying several additional anomalies in the surveillance data. The facial recognition software had detected 3 individuals in the vicinity of Riverside who didn't match any of the expected personnel or regular customers. More troubling was the fact that these individuals had appeared on cameras at strategic locations around the range's perimeter over the past hour, suggesting reconnaissance activity that preceded the current convergence event. The traffic analysis software had also flagged unusual vehicle movements in the area, including 2 vans that had taken circuitous routes to reach positions near Riverside and had remained stationary for longer periods than normal commercial or residential activity would suggest. The combination of personnel and vehicle anomalies painted a picture that Park's training told him could indicate a coordinated threat against the general or an attempt to exploit the security vulnerabilities created by the demonstration. Park's supervisor, Division Chief Margaret Liu, had immediately contacted the FBI's Tactical Response Unit and the Regional Military Security Office. The protocols for protecting general officers were clear and comprehensive, but the situation at Riverside presented unique challenges because of its civilian location and the presence of armed civilians who weren't part of the security apparatus. Any response would need to account for the possibility of collateral damage and the complications that could arise from military action in a civilian facility. At Riverside, the general had concluded his conversation with Carl Stevens and was preparing to observe the final portion of the marksmanship demonstration. His security team had arranged themselves in a standard protective formation, but their positioning was constrained by the range's layout and the presence of civilian shooters, who were continuing their practice sessions. The team leader, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had identified the tactical limitations of their current position, but was reluctant to take overt security measures that might alarm the civilians or compromise the public relations objectives of the Corrity visit. The breakthrough came when Maggie's enhanced hearing detected the distinctive sound of tactical equipment being deployed in the ceiling space directly above the general's position. The metallic clicks and fabric rustles were barely audible over the range's ambient noise, but they were unmistakably consistent with someone in tactical gear preparing weapons or surveillance equipment. The timing and location of these sounds indicated that whoever was in the ceiling had been monitoring the general's movements and was positioning themselves for optimal access to his location. Maggie's training kicked in with the sudden clarity that had characterized her most effective operational moments. The acoustic evidence, combined with the movement patterns she'd been tracking and the behavioral changes in the security team, painted a clear picture of an imminent threat against General Morrison. The attackers had used the demonstration as cover to position themselves in multiple locations around the range, and they were now preparing to execute whatever operation they had planned. The decision tree that unfolded in her mind was instantaneous and comprehensive. She could alert the security team, but doing so would reveal her own capabilities and might trigger a response that could endanger the civilian shooters. She could attempt to evacuate the range, but the time required to explain the threat and coordinate a safe withdrawal would likely exceed the window available before the attackers acted. The most effective response would be to neutralize the immediate threat while maintaining her cover, but that would require her to reveal skills that she had spent months concealing. The choice was made when she detected the sound of a weapon being loaded in the ceiling space directly above General Morrison's position. The distinctive click-thunk of a rifle bolt being cycled was unmistakable, and the timing suggested that the attack was imminent. Whatever the attackers' objectives, they were moving into the execution phase of their operation, and the general's life was in immediate danger. Maggie's transformation from recreational shooter to operational specialist was invisible but complete. Her grip on the rental pistol shifted to a proper shooting stance. Her breathing pattern changed to the controlled rhythm that optimized accuracy, and her mental state shifted to the focused calm that had characterized her most challenging missions. The months of deliberately poor shooting had been a form of muscle memory suppression, but her true skills were still there, waiting to be accessed when the situation demanded them. The challenge she faced was unique in her operational experience. She needed to neutralize a threat that the official security team hadn't yet identified, using a basic rental weapon while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid revealing her true background. The shot would need to be perfect, not just in terms of accuracy, but in terms of timing and tactical effect. The acoustic signature from the ceiling indicated that the attacker was positioning a rifle for a shot that would target the general from above, using an angle that the security team's positioning couldn't effectively cover. The trajectory would take advantage of the range's layout to provide a clear line of sight while minimizing the attacker's exposure to return fire. Maggie calculated the geometry of the threat in milliseconds, identifying the approximate position of the weapon based on the sound she'd been tracking and the tactical logic of the range's layout. The shot she would need to make was technically challenging, but well within her capabilities, assuming she could overcome the limitations of the rental equipment and execute it before the attacker could complete their own targeting sequence. Moment crystallized with the kind of terrible clarity that Maggie remembered from her most dangerous missions. Above the general's position, a section of ceiling tile shifted almost imperceptibly, creating a narrow gap that would provide the perfect angle for a sniper's shot. The movement was so subtle that none of the security team noticed it. Their attention focused on ground-level threats and the predictable security patterns they'd been trained to monitor. But Maggie's enhanced situational awareness, honed through years of counter-sniper operations, recognized the tactical significance. Immediately, the attackers had chosen their timing perfectly. General Morrison was positioned near the center of the range, engaged in animated conversation with several civilian shooters who had gathered around him to express their appreciation for military service. His security detail maintained their protective positions, but their formation was designed to counter threats from the perimeter, not from elevated positions within the facility itself. The overhead attack vector represented a blind spot in their coverage that demonstrated sophisticated operational planning. Tommy Brennan was in the middle of recounting his theories about proper shooting techniques, his voice carrying across the range as he attempted to impress the general with his knowledge of firearms and tactical procedures. His positioning had inadvertently placed him directly between the general and the most obvious escape route, creating an additional complication for any security response that might be required. General Morrison was nodding enthusiastically at Tommy's commentary, clearly enjoying the opportunity to be part of a conversation with genuine military personnel. The civilian shooters at the other lanes continued their practice sessions, oblivious to the developing threat. Their shooting created a steady background of gunfire that would mask any additional shots, whether from the attackers or from any defensive response. The acoustic camouflage was another element that suggested professional planning, indicating that the attackers understood how to exploit the environment to minimize detection and maximize their operational window. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the security team leader, had begun to sense that something was wrong, though he couldn't identify the specific source of his unease. His years of protective detail experience had developed an instinct for detecting threats that weren't yet visible, and that instinct was now triggering warning signals. He'd increased his scan rate and had subtly signaled his team to heighten their alertness, but without a specific threat to focus on. Their response remained reactive rather than proactive. Lieutenant Colonel Webb had received another encrypted message on her communication device, this one containing information that made her face go pale despite her professional composure. The message was from the FBI's Tactical Response Unit, informing her that they had identified credible intelligence about a potential attack on General Morrison during his visit to Riverside. The intelligence was fragmentary and time-sensitive, providing enough information to confirm a threat, but not enough detail to formulate an effective response. The warning had come too late for a conventional security response. The FBI's tactical team was still 20 minutes away, and local law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle a sophisticated military-style attack. The general's existing security detail was competent but small, designed for routine protective duties rather than active combat situations. The responsibility for neutralizing the immediate threat would fall to whatever resources were available at the scene. Maggie had identified the precise location of the overhead threat, based on the acoustic signatures she'd been tracking and the tactical geometry of the range. The sniper was positioned in a maintenance space above the suspended ceiling, using an access point that provided both concealment and a clear shot at the general's current position. The angle would allow for a high probability hit while making return fire, extremely difficult for the ground-based security team. The rental pistol in her hands was a basic Glock 19, reliable but unmodified, with standard iron sights and a trigger that had seen heavy use by countless civilian shooters. The ammunition was basic full metal jacket rounds, adequate for target shooting but not optimized for precision work. Under normal circumstances, the equipment limitations would make the shot she was contemplating extremely challenging, but Maggie's training had included scenarios where operators had to achieve precision results with suboptimal equipment. The mathematical calculation that unfolded in her mind accounted for multiple variables: the approximate range to the target, the ballistic characteristics of the standard ammunition, the sight offset of the rental weapon, and the angle required to penetrate the ceiling material and reach the sniper's position. She also had to factor in the timing element, calculating the window of opportunity before the sniper could complete his own targeting sequence and fire at the general. The ceiling tiles at Riverside were standard commercial grade, consisting of mineral fiber panels suspended in a metal grid system. The sniper had chosen his position to take advantage of a section where the tiles could be easily displaced, but that same accessibility meant that the material wouldn't provide significant protection against incoming fire. A well-placed shot from below could penetrate the ceiling and reach the sniper's position, but it would require precise placement to account for the deflection and trajectory changes caused by the intervening material. Maggie's breathing pattern shifted to the controlled rhythm that had become automatic during her years of precision shooting. The technique involved a specific sequence of breath control that optimized her body's stability and minimized the physiological factors that could affect accuracy. Her heart rate, which had been elevated by the stress of the situation, began to settle into the steady pattern that characterized her best shooting performance. The transformation in her shooting stance was subtle but complete. Her grip on the pistol shifted from the loose, uncertain hold she'd been maintaining for months to the firm, controlled grip that maximized weapon stability. Her feet repositioned themselves to create a stable shooting platform, and her non-shooting hand moved to provide proper support for the weapon. The changes were made smoothly and quietly, designed to avoid attracting attention from the other shooters or the security team. The sight picture that appeared through the Glock's iron sights was different from what she'd been deliberately creating during her months of poor shooting. Instead of the misaligned, rushed sight pictures that had produced her scattered shot groups, she now achieved the precise alignment that had characterized her military marksmanship. The front sight post centered perfectly in the rear sight notch, creating the crisp, clear sight picture that was essential for precision shooting. The target she had identified was not visible in any conventional sense. The ceiling appeared solid and uniform from her position at lane 7, with no obvious indication of the threat lurking above. But her calculation had identified the precise point where her bullet would need to impact to reach the sniper's position, accounting for the trajectory required to penetrate the ceiling material and maintain sufficient energy to neutralize the target. The pressure of the trigger beneath her finger felt familiar despite the months of deliberately poor trigger control she'd been practicing. The Glock's trigger had a specific feel and weight that she could now exploit to achieve the smooth, straight-back trigger pull that was essential for accurate shooting. The muscle memory that had been suppressed for so long reasserted itself, providing the precise control needed for the demanding shot. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The moment stretched as Maggie made her final preparations, her enhanced awareness taking in every detail of the tactical situation. General Morrison continued his conversation with the civilian shooters, unaware of the threat positioned above him. The security team maintained their alert positions, still focused on ground-level threats. The other shooters continued their practice, their gunfire providing the acoustic cover that would mask her own shot. The decision to fire represented a point of no return that would end her months of anonymity and reveal her true capabilities to everyone present. The shot erupted from lane 7 with a crack that was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. To the casual observer, it was just another round being fired during practice at Riverside Community Range, indistinguishable from the dozens of other shots that had echoed through the facility during the afternoon. But the precision and timing of that single bullet represented the culmination of years of elite training and the split-second decision of a woman who had spent months concealing her true nature. The bullet's trajectory was mathematically perfect, accounting for the slight upward angle required to penetrate the ceiling tiles and reach the target area Maggie had calculated. The standard 9mm round punched through the mineral fiber ceiling material with minimal deflection, maintaining enough velocity and accuracy to strike the sniper who had been positioning his rifle for a shot at General Morrison. The impact was immediate and decisive, neutralizing the threat before the attacker could complete his targeting sequence. Above the suspended ceiling, the sniper's carefully planned operation disintegrated in an instant. He had been lying prone in the maintenance space, his rifle trained on the general through the gap he'd created in the ceiling tiles. His finger had been moving toward the trigger when Maggie's bullet found its mark, striking him in the shoulder and spinning him away from his weapon. The rifle clattered against the metal ceiling grid, its barrel swinging away from the target area as the wounded sniper struggled to maintain his position. The sound of the rifle hitting the ceiling infrastructure was distinct from the normal acoustic signature of the range, a metallic clanging that carried clearly over the background noise of recreational shooting. Several people looked up reflexively, their attention drawn by the unusual sound, but most dismissed it as routine building maintenance or settling. Only Master Sergeant Rodriguez recognized the significance, his trained ear identifying the sound of a weapon being displaced in an overhead position. Rodriguez's reaction was instantaneous and professional. His years of protective detail experience had programmed him to respond to acoustic anomalies with immediate tactical assessment, and the metallic sound from above triggered every alarm in his tactical consciousness. His hand moved to his sidearm while his eyes scanned the ceiling, looking for any visual confirmation of the threat his ears had detected. His body positioned itself between General Morrison and the source of the sound, following protective protocols that had become automatic through years of training. The general himself had also heard the distinctive sound, and his own military experience allowed him to recognize its potential significance. His conversation with the civilian shooters continued, but his posture shifted subtly, his body turning slightly to present a smaller target profile while maintaining the appearance of casual interaction. His eyes met Rodriguez's for a fraction of a second, confirming that both men had identified a potential threat and were prepared to respond accordingly. Maggie maintained her position at Lane 7, her expression showing no indication that she had just fired the most important shot of her civilian life. She continued through the motions of her practice session, ejecting the spent cartridge case and loading a fresh round as if nothing unusual had occurred. Her breathing remained controlled, her stance relaxed, and her demeanor consistent with that of a recreational shooter working through a routine training session. But her awareness was operating at maximum intensity, monitoring the tactical situation for any indication that additional threats might be present. The acoustic signature she'd been tracking suggested that the overhead sniper was part of a larger operation, and neutralizing one threat didn't necessarily mean that the danger had passed. Her enhanced hearing continued to analyze the building's sound patterns, searching for evidence of other attackers who might be moving into position. The wounded sniper above was struggling to maintain consciousness while trying to extricate himself from the ceiling space. The bullet had struck him in the right shoulder, damaging muscle and bone while sending shock waves through his nervous system. His rifle had fallen beyond his reach, and his mobility was severely compromised by both the wound and the confined space of the maintenance area. His mission had failed completely, but his training dictated that he should attempt to escape and evade capture. Tommy Brennan, who had been standing near General Morrison during the shooting, had heard the metallic sound from above, but was continuing his animated discussion about firearm techniques. His civilian background provided no context for interpreting the acoustic anomaly, and he remained focused on impressing the general with his knowledge of shooting sports. His positioning, which had been a tactical complication earlier, now provided an element of concealment for the general as the security team assessed the overhead threat. Kenny Morrison had also heard the unusual sound but had dismissed it as building maintenance, focusing instead on his opportunity to share his own military experiences with a genuine general officer. His enthusiasm for the conversation had made him oblivious to the subtle changes in the security team's alertness level, and he continued his storytelling while the tactical situation evolved around him. Lieutenant Colonel Webb had received another urgent message on her encrypted communication device, this one containing updated intelligence about the threat against General Morrison. The FBI's analysis had identified 3 potential attack vectors, including the possibility of an overhead sniper using the range's ceiling space for concealment. The intelligence was confirming what had just occurred, but the tactical response was now focused on identifying and neutralizing any remaining threats. Carl Stevens, the range manager, had noticed the change in atmosphere but couldn't identify the specific cause. His experience managing civilian shooting ranges hadn't prepared him for the subtleties of military security operations, and he was uncertain whether the increased tension he sensed was related to normal protective protocols or something more significant. His primary concern was ensuring that his facility continued to operate safely while accommodating the needs of his distinguished visitors. The other civilian shooters at Riverside continued their practice sessions, most of them unaware that anything unusual had occurred. The background noise of recreational shooting had masked the significance of Maggie's shot, and the acoustic anomaly from above had been too subtle for most people to notice. Their continued shooting provided ongoing cover for any security response that might be required, while also creating potential complications for tactical movement within the range. David Park, monitoring the situation from his remote facility, had detected the acoustic signature of Maggie's shot through the surveillance system's audio feeds. His analysis software had identified the shot as different from the typical recreational shooting patterns, noting the precision of timing and the unusual upward trajectory that distinguished it from standard target practice. The acoustic analysis suggested that the shot had been fired with tactical intent rather than recreational purpose. The facial recognition software had also detected a subtle change in Maggie's biometric indicators immediately before and after the shot. Her heart rate and breathing patterns had shifted into ranges that were consistent with operational stress rather than recreational activity, suggesting that she had been responding to a tactical situation. The biometric data was circumstantial but significant, adding another layer of evidence to Park's growing assessment that Maggie Chen was not the recreational shooter she appeared to be. The wounded sniper's attempts to escape through the ceiling space were creating additional acoustic signatures that Maggie continued to monitor. His movements were becoming more erratic as blood loss and shock affected his coordination, and his attempts to navigate the confined maintenance area were producing sounds that could potentially alert other people in the range to his presence. Revelation began with a single drop of blood that fell from the ceiling onto the concrete floor near General Morrison's position. The crimson spot appeared suddenly on the gray surface, clearly visible against the range's fluorescent lighting. Master Sergeant Rodriguez spotted it immediately, his trained eye recognizing the significance of blood appearing from an overhead source. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, while his other hand gestured subtly to his team members, initiating a coordinated response to the confirmed threat. Within seconds, more drops followed, creating a small pattern on the floor that clearly indicated someone wounded was positioned above the general's location. The blood evidence transformed Rodriguez's suspicions into tactical certainty, confirming that there had indeed been a sniper in the ceiling space, and that the threat had been neutralized by unknown means. His protective instincts kicked into high gear as he began implementing protocols for dealing with a compromised position. Guardian 6, we have blood evidence from overhead position, Rodriguez spoke quietly into his radio, using the code designation for General Morrison while alerting the command structure to the confirmed threat. Initiating immediate relocation of principal to secure area. His voice carried the controlled urgency of someone trained to manage crisis situations while maintaining operational security. General Morrison's response was immediate and professional. Years of military service in dangerous environments had programmed him to respond instantly to security alerts, and he smoothly transitioned from his civilian interaction mode to tactical awareness. Without creating alarm among the civilian shooters, he began moving toward the exit route that his security team had identified during their initial assessment of the facility. Tommy, Brennan, and Kenny Morrison suddenly found their conversation with the general curtailed as the security team efficiently but politely created distance between their principal and the civilian shooters. The transition was handled with such professional smoothness that neither man immediately realized they were witnessing an active security response. They interpreted the general's movement as a natural conclusion to their interaction rather than a tactical withdrawal from a threat zone. Lieutenant Colonel Webb had coordinated with local emergency services, and the first police units were already en route to Riverside. The FBI's tactical response team had been notified of the confirmed attack and was accelerating their response timeline, though they were still 15 minutes away from the scene. The coordination required careful management to ensure that local law enforcement didn't inadvertently compromise the military security operation or create additional tactical complications. Carl Stevens finally realized that something serious was happening when he saw the blood on the floor and observed the security team's coordinated response. His civilian background provided no frame of reference for managing such a situation, and he began following the security team's instructions. While trying to maintain some semblance of normal operations for his other customers, his primary concern was preventing panic among the civilian shooters while ensuring that his facility could accommodate whatever response was required. The wounded sniper above was becoming increasingly desperate as his physical condition deteriorated, and his escape options narrowed. The ceiling space that had provided concealment for his attack now became a trap, with limited access points and no way to reach ground level without exposing himself to the security team below. His attempts to move through the maintenance area were creating additional noise that made his position increasingly obvious to anyone listening carefully. Maggie continued her practice session with deliberate normalcy, maintaining the facade of a recreational shooter while closely monitoring the evolving tactical situation. Her enhanced awareness was tracking multiple elements simultaneously: the wounded sniper's movements above, the security team's response patterns, the positions of civilian shooters, and the potential for additional threats that might still be undetected. Her years of operational experience had taught her that neutralizing one threat didn't guarantee that others weren't present. The acoustic analysis that had allowed her to identify and neutralize the sniper was now providing information about the attacker's current condition and location. The irregular sounds from above suggested that he was wounded but still mobile, potentially armed, and possibly attempting to reach an extraction point. The tactical situation remained fluid, with the possibility that other elements of the attack plan might still be in motion. David Park's monitoring station had detected the security team's radio communications and was coordinating with multiple agencies to provide intelligence support for the response. The surveillance systems at Riverside were being enhanced with additional monitoring capabilities, and facial recognition software was analyzing every person who had entered or left the facility during the past 6 hours. The investigation was expanding rapidly as the full scope of the attempt became apparent. The FBI's preliminary analysis had identified the attack as a sophisticated operation that demonstrated detailed knowledge of General Morrison's schedule and the security protocol surrounding his visit. The timing and execution suggested professional training and extensive reconnaissance, indicating that this was not a spontaneous or amateur attempt. The investigation would need to determine how the attackers had obtained their intelligence and whether additional attempts might be planned. Rodriguez had established secure communication with the incoming police units, coordinating their response to ensure that law enforcement personnel could distinguish between legitimate security team members and potential threats. The complexity of managing multiple agencies during an active security incident required careful coordination to prevent friendly fire incidents or tactical confusion that could compromise the response. The first police officers to arrive at Riverside were briefed quickly on the situation and began establishing a perimeter around the facility. Their role was primarily to prevent additional threats from approaching the scene, while the military security team managed the immediate tactical response. The coordination between civilian law enforcement and military security required careful navigation of jurisdictional boundaries and operational protocols. General Morrison had been successfully relocated to a secure area within the range, where his security team could better control access and observation angles. The position provided protection from overhead threats while maintaining communication capabilities with the Response Coordination Center. His calm demeanor throughout the incident reflected both his military experience and his confidence in his security team's capabilities. At the civilian shooters at Riverside were beginning to realize that something unusual was happening, though most still didn't understand the full scope of the situation. The presence of additional law enforcement personnel and the obviously heightened alert level of the military security team created an atmosphere of tension that was difficult to ignore. Some began asking questions, while others simply continued their shooting practice, uncertain how to respond to the developing situation. Kenny Morrison was the first civilian to notice the blood on the floor, pointing it out to Tommy Brennan with obvious concern. "That wasn't there before," he said, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone trying to process information that didn't fit his expectations. Tommy's response was equally confused, as both men struggled to understand how blood could have appeared from overhead during what had seemed like a routine demonstration. The wounded sniper's condition was continuing to deteriorate, and his movements in the ceiling space were becoming more erratic and dangerous. The combination of blood loss, shock, and desperation was affecting his judgment, potentially making him more unpredictable and dangerous than a calm, trained operative. The security team needed to consider the possibility that he might attempt a suicide attack or try to take hostages if he managed to reach ground level. Maggie's assessment of the tactical situation indicated that the immediate threat to General Morrison had been neutralized, but the broader security situation remained uncertain. The sophistication of the attack suggested that backup plans and additional resources might be available to the attackers, and the response needed to account for the possibility of follow-up attempts or escalation. The breakthrough in understanding came when Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, one of Rodriguez's team members, made a connection that had eluded everyone else at the scene. Santos had been analyzing the trajectory that would have been required to neutralize the overhead sniper, working backward from the blood evidence and the acoustic signatures to determine where the defensive shot had originated. Her calculations pointed directly to Lane 7, where Maggie continued her seemingly oblivious practice session. Santos approached Rodriguez with her analysis, speaking in the low, urgent tones that military personnel used when discussing sensitive tactical information. "Sergeant, the geometry doesn't work for any of our positions," she reported, her voice barely audible over the range's background noise. "The only angle that could have reached the sniper's position is from Lane 7. That civilian shooter may have just saved the general's life." Rodriguez's eyes shifted to Maggie's position with new understanding, his tactical mind reassessing everything he had observed about her during the past hour. The scattered shot groups on her target, the uncertain handling of her weapon, the apparent discomfort with basic shooting procedures, all of it now appeared in a different light. If Santos was correct, then the woman they had dismissed as an incompetent recreational shooter had just executed one of the most precise defensive shots he had ever witnessed. The realization created a tactical dilemma that Rodriguez had never encountered in his years of protective detail work. If Maggie Chen was responsible for neutralizing the sniper, then she possessed skills that were completely inconsistent with her apparent civilian status. The shot required expertise that was typically found only among military or law enforcement personnel with specialized training, yet she had executed it while maintaining perfect operational security and plausible deniability. Lieutenant Colonel Webb received an encrypted message that added another layer of complexity to the situation. The FBI's facial recognition analysis had finally produced results on the wounded sniper, identifying him as Markus Volkov, a former Spetsnaz operative, who had been linked to several assassination attempts in Eastern Europe. The identification confirmed that the attack on General Morrison had been carried out by professional military personnel, not domestic terrorists or amateur assassins. The profile of Markus Volkov painted a picture of a highly skilled operative with extensive experience in precision shooting and covert operations. His presence at Riverside represented a significant escalation in the threats facing senior military personnel, suggesting that foreign intelligence services or international criminal organizations were targeting American military leadership. The implications for national security were profound and would require immediate attention from the highest levels of government. David Park's analysis team had been working frantically to piece together the intelligence picture surrounding the attack attempt. Their preliminary findings suggested that Volkov had not been working alone, and that the operation at Riverside was part of a larger conspiracy targeting multiple military officials. The complexity of the plot indicated months of planning and significant financial resources, pointing toward state-sponsored terrorism or organized criminal activity. The surveillance footage from the area around Riverside was being analyzed frame by frame, looking for evidence of Volkov's support network and any additional operatives who might still be in the area. The FBI had identified several suspicious vehicles and individuals who had been positioned at strategic locations around the range, suggesting that the attack had been planned with multiple contingencies and escape routes. Maggie's continued presence at Lane 7 was beginning to attract more attention from the security personnel, though she maintained her facade of oblivious recreational shooting. Her enhanced awareness had detected the increased scrutiny, and she was preparing contingency plans for maintaining her cover story if questioned about her activities during the incident. The challenge was explaining how she could have remained unaware of such dramatic events occurring around her. The wounded sniper above was making increasingly desperate attempts to escape from the ceiling space, his movements becoming more erratic as shock and blood loss affected his coordination. The access point he had used to enter the maintenance area was now blocked by law enforcement personnel, and his attempts to find alternative routes were creating additional acoustic signatures that confirmed his trapped status. Rodriguez made the decision to approach Maggie directly, recognizing that her potential role in neutralizing the threat needed to be addressed immediately. The tactical situation required clarity about what had occurred and who was responsible for the defensive action that had saved General Morrison's life. His approach was professional but direct, designed to elicit information without compromising operational security. "Ma'am, I'm Master Sergeant Rodriguez with General Morrison Security Detail," he said, positioning himself at a respectful distance from her shooting station. "We're investigating an incident that occurred during the demonstration, and we'd like to ask you a few questions about what you may have observed." His tone was courteous but carried the authority of someone conducting an official security investigation. Maggie's response was perfectly calibrated to match her established persona as a recreational shooter who was overwhelmed by the sudden attention from military personnel. "Oh my goodness, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice carrying just the right amount of concern and confusion. "I heard some strange noises, but I thought it was just building maintenance. I hope nobody was hurt." The performance was flawless, demonstrating the kind of operational discipline that characterized elite intelligence personnel. Her body language suggested genuine concern mixed with civilian confusion, and her questions were exactly what an innocent bystander would ask in such circumstances. But Rodriguez is trained. I was looking for subtleties that might reveal inconsistencies in her cover story. Santos had positioned herself where she could observe Maggie's reactions and responses, looking for any indication that her civilian facade might be deliberate deception. The sergeant's experience with interrogation and human intelligence had taught her to recognize the tells that distinguished genuine civilians from trained operatives attempting to blend in with civilian populations. The first police detective to arrive at the scene was Inspector Janet Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the force with extensive experience in investigating attacks against public officials. Her preliminary assessment of the crime scene focused on establishing the sequence of events and identifying all potential witnesses who might have information relevant to the investigation. Walsh's interview process would be thorough and systematic, designed to elicit information from civilian witnesses, while avoiding contamination of the evidence or compromise of ongoing security operations. Her coordination with the FBI and military security personnel required careful balance between law enforcement procedures and national security considerations. General Morrison himself had been briefed on the preliminary findings and was insisting on personally thanking whoever had been responsible for neutralizing the sniper. His military background had given him an appreciation for the skill and courage required to execute such a precise defensive shot under pressure, and he wanted to ensure that the person responsible received appropriate recognition. The tactical analysis of the shooting was revealing additional details about the precision required to neutralize the sniper from Maggie's position. The shot had been executed through sealing material that would have deflected most bullets, requiring exact calculations of trajectory and ballistics to achieve the desired effect. The level of expertise demonstrated was consistent with advanced military training rather than civilian marksmanship. Maggie's rental pistol was being examined by ballistics experts, who were documenting the evidence of its recent use. The analysis would determine whether the weapon had been fired during the time frame of the incident and whether the ballistic evidence was consistent with the defensive shot that had neutralized the sniper. The moment of revelation arrived when Inspector Walsh completed her ballistics analysis and approached Rodriguez with results that transformed everyone's understanding of what had occurred at Riverside. The rental pistol from Lane 7 had indeed fired the shot that neutralized Marcus Volkov, and the precision of that shot was unlike anything the inspector had encountered in 20 years of investigating shootings. The trajectory calculations, the timing, and the tactical awareness required to execute such a shot pointed to someone with extraordinary training and experience. Rodriguez found himself facing Maggie with new respect and a dozen questions that couldn't be asked in a civilian setting. Her continued insistence that she had simply been practicing recreational shooting was becoming increasingly implausible given the ballistic evidence, but her operational discipline remained perfect. She maintained her facade with the kind of consistency that suggested years of experience in maintaining cover identities under pressure. "Ma'am, I need to ask you directly," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had reached the limits of diplomatic inquiry. "The ballistic evidence indicates that a shot from your position neutralized a sniper who was targeting General Morrison. That shot saved his life, and it required skills that go well beyond recreational shooting. We need to understand who you really are." Maggie's response was a masterclass in operational security under direct questioning. Her expression showed the perfect combination of confusion and concern that a civilian would display when confronted with such extraordinary accusations. "I think there must be some mistake, Sergeant," she said, her voice trembling slightly with what appeared to be genuine distress. "I'm just here practicing my shooting. I couldn't possibly have done what you're describing." But General Morrison himself had approached the conversation, having been briefed on the ballistic findings and the tactical analysis of the incident. His years of military experience had given him an eye for recognizing exceptional soldiers, and something about Maggie's demeanor triggered his professional instincts. The way she carried herself, the subtle awareness in her eyes, the controlled breathing that suggested stress management training, all pointed to someone with military background. "Miss Chen," the general said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through evasion and getting to the truth. "I've been a soldier for 32 years, and I know one when I see one. The shot that saved my life today was executed by someone with advanced military training. I'd like to know who I have to thank for being alive." The direct appeal from General Morrison created a tactical dilemma that Maggie had hoped to avoid. Her operational protocols called for maintaining her civilian cover at all costs, but the general's personal involvement and the ballistic evidence made continued denial increasingly difficult. The challenge was finding a way to acknowledge her role without revealing the full extent of her background or compromising the security classifications that still protected her true identity. David Park, monitoring the conversation through the surveillance systems, was simultaneously running facial recognition software through military personnel databases that required higher security clearances. The preliminary results were fragmentary but significant, suggesting that Maggie Chen's military service record had been classified at levels that required special access permissions. The classification codes associated with her file were consistent with special operations, personnel whose identities were protected for national security reasons. The breakthrough came when Park's supervisor authorized access to Level 4 classified databases, revealing partial records that transformed their understanding of who Maggie Chen really was. The files indicated that she had served with distinction in specialized units, had received commendations for marksmanship and tactical operations, and had been involved in classified missions that remained protected even years after her discharge from active duty. Lieutenant Colonel Webb received the intelligence briefing with growing amazement and understanding. The woman who had been dismissed by civilian shooters as incompetent was actually a decorated veteran with advanced training in precision shooting and counter-sniper operations. Her presence at Riverside during the attack on General Morrison was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of protective capabilities that went far beyond anything in her official civilian records. The wounded sniper above had finally lost consciousness from blood loss, ending his attempts to escape and allowing tactical teams to safely extract him from the ceiling space. The medical team that treated him confirmed that the shot that had wounded him was executed with surgical precision, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, demonstrating the kind of tactical restraint that characterized elite military personnel. Inspector Walsh's investigation was expanding to include a comprehensive background check on Maggie Chen, but the classified nature of her military service was creating jurisdictional complications. The FBI's National Security Division had taken over certain aspects of the investigation, recognizing that the case involved personnel and operations that fell under federal security classifications. Tommy, Brennan, and Kenny Morrison had been questioned as witnesses, and their accounts of Maggie's apparent incompetence with firearms were creating additional intrigue for the investigators. The contrast between their observations and the ballistic evidence suggested either that they had completely misunderstood what they were witnessing, or that Maggie had been deliberately concealing her capabilities for reasons that remained unclear. Carl Stevens was cooperating fully with the investigation, providing access to his facility's records and surveillance systems. His own confusion about the events was genuine, as his civilian background provided no framework for understanding how a seemingly incompetent shooter could have executed such an extraordinary defensive shot. The range's electronic systems were being analyzed for any evidence of prior reconnaissance or planning by the attackers. The tactical analysis team had reconstructed the entire sequence of events, from Volkov's infiltration of the ceiling space to Maggie's precisely timed offensive shot. The timeline revealed that she had identified and neutralized the threat within seconds of its becoming lethal, demonstrating situational awareness and reaction times that were consistent with elite military training. General Morrison security detail was reviewing their own protocols in light of the incident, recognizing that their standard protective measures had been inadequate against the sophisticated attack they had faced. The fact that their principal's life had been saved by an apparently civilian shooter raised questions about how they could better coordinate with potential assets who might be present in civilian environments. Maggie's rental agreement and identification documents were being subjected to detailed analysis, looking for any inconsistencies that might reveal additional information about her background. The preliminary findings suggested that her civilian identity was legitimate but incomplete. lacking the kind of detailed personal history that would be expected for someone with no military background. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was studying surveillance footage of Maggie's actions during the incident, looking for micro-expressions and behavioral patterns that might reveal her true level of training and experience. The analysis was confirming what the ballistic evidence had already suggested, that her apparent civilian demeanor was a carefully maintained facade, covering much more significant capabilities. As the investigation continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that the woman who had been mocked by civilian shooters for her poor marksmanship had just demonstrated some of the most advanced tactical skills that any of the military personnel present had ever witnessed. The precise shot that had saved General Morrison's life would become the subject of detailed analysis and discussion in military and law enforcement circles for years to come. The quiet exit that Maggie had planned was no longer possible, as her role in neutralizing the sniper had made her a central figure in a major national security investigation. The anonymity she had carefully maintained for months was dissolving under the scrutiny of multiple federal agencies, each seeking to understand how a decorated veteran had ended up providing covert protection for a general officer during a sophisticated assassination attempt. The classified briefing that followed took place in a secure conference room at the regional FBI field office, where representatives from multiple agencies had gathered to piece together the full scope of what had occurred. At Riverside, General Morrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by Lieutenant Colonel Webb and Master Sergeant Rodriguez, while FBI Special Agent Catherine Cross led the briefing with intelligence analysts from various departments contributing their findings. Preliminary investigation had revealed that Marcus Volkov's assassination attempt was part of a larger operation targeting senior military officials across 3 states. Intelligence intercepts had identified at least 6 other potential targets, including 2 other general officers and several key defense contractors who were involved in classified weapons development programs. The scope of the conspiracy suggested coordination by a foreign intelligence service with significant resources and detailed knowledge of American military operations. Agent Cross displayed satellite imagery showing the sophisticated surveillance network that had been monitoring General Morrison's activities for at least 6 weeks prior to the attack. The imagery revealed observation posts at multiple locations along his regular routes, including his home, office, and various public appearances. The level of preparation demonstrated professional intelligence gathering capabilities that went far beyond what domestic terrorist groups typically possessed. The forensic analysis of Volkov's equipment had provided additional insights into the sophistication of the operation. His rifle was a customized precision weapon with specialized ammunition designed for maximum lethality at close range. The communication equipment found on his person included encrypted devices that were consistent with military-grade hardware used by foreign intelligence services. Most significantly, the tactical gear he carried included detailed floor plans of Riverside and precise timing information about General Morrison's scheduled visit. Intelligence analysts had traced the source of this information through several layers of operational security, eventually identifying a leak within the military administrative structure that had provided the attackers with inside information about the general's schedule and security arrangements. The investigation into this breach was ongoing, but preliminary findings suggested that the conspiracy included at least 1 individual with legitimate access to classified scheduling information. During the briefing, Agent Cross revealed the results of the enhanced background investigation into Margaret Chen's military service record. With appropriate security clearances now in place, the full scope of her operational history was finally accessible to the investigative team. The revelations were extraordinary, painting a picture of a soldier whose capabilities far exceeded anything suggested by her current civilian lifestyle. Staff Sergeant Margaret Chen had served with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, commonly known as Delta Force, for 6 years following her initial military service. Her specialization had been precision marksmanship and counter-sniper operations with advanced training in urban warfare and close protection duties. Her service record included deployments to classified locations where she had participated in operations that remained protected under the highest levels of national security. Classification. The commendations in her file were remarkable, including 3 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star, for actions that were described only in the most general terms due to their classified nature. Her marksmanship records showed consistent performance at levels that placed her among the top 1% of military snipers, with documented successful engagements at ranges exceeding 1,200 meters. Her instructional duties had included training other special operations personnel in advanced shooting techniques and tactical planning. Most significantly, her final operation before leaving active duty had involved a classified mission that resulted in the neutralization of an international assassination team that had been targeting American diplomatic personnel. The mission had been successful, but the exposure of her identity to hostile intelligence services had necessitated her transition to civilian life under enhanced security protocols. Her discharge had been orchestrated to provide maximum protection for her identity while allowing her to maintain a normal civilian existence. General Morrison listened to these revelations with growing amazement and respect. The woman who had saved his life was not simply a trained soldier, but one of the most elite marksmen in the history of American special operations. Her decision to remain anonymous and her months of deliberately poor shooting at Riverside represented a level of operational discipline that was remarkable even by military standards. The psychological profile that had been developed during the briefing process revealed additional insights into Maggie's transition to civilian life. The trauma of her final military operation, combined with the security requirements that had forced her into anonymity, had created challenges that were common among veterans of classified operations. Her choice to frequent a shooting range while deliberately concealing her abilities represented a form of therapy that allowed her to maintain her skills while processing the emotional weight of her service. Agent Cross presented surveillance footage from Riverside that had been enhanced and analyzed frame by frame, revealing subtleties in Maggie's behavior that had not been apparent during the original incident. The footage showed micro-movements and reaction patterns that were consistent with someone maintaining constant tactical awareness while appearing to be completely oblivious to her surroundings. Her positioning throughout the afternoon had actually provided optimal observation angles for monitoring potential threats, suggesting that her presence at the range during the general's visit might not have been entirely coincidental. The investigation had also revealed that Maggie had been receiving periodic security briefings through unofficial channels, keeping her informed about potential threats to military personnel in her area. These briefings were part of a broader program designed to provide passive protection for high-value civilian assets who retained the capability to respond to security threats. Her presence at Riverside during General Morrison's visit had been encouraged by handlers who recognized the potential for exactly the kind of incident that had occurred. Intelligence analysts had identified patterns in recent attacks against military personnel that suggested the conspiracy targeting General Morrison was part of a larger campaign designed to destabilize American military leadership. The precision and timing of these attacks indicated coordination by a sophisticated adversary with detailed knowledge of American security procedures and military operations. The successful defense at Riverside had disrupted this campaign and provided valuable intelligence about the attackers' methods and capabilities. The tactical analysis of Maggie's defensive shot had been completed by military marksmanship experts, who confirmed that the shot represented one of the most technically challenging defensive engagements they had ever evaluated. The combination of factors that had to be calculated and executed simultaneously including trajectory compensation, timing, target identification, and collateral damage avoidance, required skills that were possessed by only a handful of individuals. Worldwide, Lieutenant Colonel Webb presented the recommendation that had emerged from the military's internal review of the incident. Given the exceptional nature of Maggie's service and her demonstrated continuing value as a protective asset, the Department of Defense was prepared to offer her a consulting position that would provide appropriate compensation while allowing her to maintain her civilian status. The position would involve providing security assessments and training for military personnel while operating under enhanced protection protocols. General Morrison had requested permission to personally thank Maggie for saving his life and to offer her recognition that was appropriate to the significance of her actions. The challenge was balancing the need for public acknowledgement with the security requirements that continued to protect her identity and operational capabilities. The briefing concluded with Agent Cross outlining the ongoing investigation into the broader conspiracy and the enhanced security measures that were being implemented to protect other potential targets. The successful defense at Riverside had provided valuable intelligence about the attackers' capabilities and methods, but it had also revealed the scope of the threat facing American military leadership. The implications of the case extended far beyond the single incident at Riverside, raising questions about the adequacy of current security procedures and the potential value of incorporating unconventional protective assets into standard security planning. The extraordinary capabilities demonstrated by a single individual had prevented what could have been a significant blow to American military leadership and national security. 6 months later, Maggie Chen walked into a different shooting range. 3 states away, her weathered backpack slung over her shoulder and her hair pulled back in the same practical style that had characterized her time at Riverside. The new facility was smaller, quieter, with a clientele that seemed more focused on serious marksmanship than social interaction. She approached the rental counter with the same uncertain demeanor that had served her so well before, asking hesitant questions about ammunition types and range procedures. The young clerk handed her the paperwork with a friendly smile, explaining the basic safety rules while Maggie nodded attentively and asked the kinds of questions that suggested genuine inexperience. Her new identity documents were perfect, crafted by the same government specialists who had protected her transition to civilian life years earlier. Margaret Sullivan recently relocated from the Midwest, looking to learn basic shooting skills for personal protection. At lane 12, she loaded the rental pistol with deliberate clumsiness, her first few shots scattering across the target in a pattern that drew sympathetic looks from other shooters. An older gentleman at the adjacent lane offered unsolicited advice about proper stance and breathing, which she accepted with grateful appreciation. The routine was familiar and comforting, a return to the anonymity that had been shattered by her moment of heroism. General Morrison had received his promotion to Joint Chiefs of Staff, partly based on his exemplary handling of the security crisis and the intelligence gathered from the thwarted assassination attempt. In his acceptance speech, he spoke about the unknown heroes who served their country without recognition, never mentioning names or details that might compromise ongoing operations. Those who knew the full story understood the significance of his words. The conspiracy that had targeted American military leadership had been dismantled through international cooperation and the intelligence gathered from Marcus Volkov's operation. 17 individuals across 4 countries had been arrested, and the foreign intelligence networks that had supported them were being systematically neutralized. The success at Riverside had prevented what intelligence analysts later determined could have been a coordinated attack that might have eliminated multiple senior military officials. At her new range, Maggie missed the bullseye again, shaking her head with apparent frustration while the other shooters looked on with a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed superiority. She had found her peace once again in the simple act of being underestimated, carrying her extraordinary capabilities hidden beneath a facade of ordinary struggle. The quiet hero had returned to the shadows where she belonged, ready to emerge. Again only when duty demanded it. Tommy Brennan was visiting his sister in the neighboring state when he decided to try out a new shooting range he'd heard about. As he walked into the facility, boasting loudly to his companion about his expertise with firearms, his eyes fell on a familiar figure at Lane 12. The woman looked exactly like the incompetent shooter from Riverside, the one everyone had mocked for her terrible marksmanship. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, approaching her lane with a condescending grin. "If it isn't Annie Oakley herself. Still can't hit the broad side of a barn, I see." He gestured at her scattered shot pattern, chuckling at what he assumed was continued incompetence. Maggie looked up with the same uncertain expression she'd perfected over months of practice. "Oh, hello," she said softly, appearing slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I'm still learning. It's harder than it looks in the movies." Tommy launched into his familiar routine, offering unwanted advice while positioning himself as the superior marksman. Other shooters gathered around, some offering encouragement, others shaking their heads at her apparent struggles. The scene was a perfect recreation of her experience at Riverside, complete with the casual condescension and amateur expertise she'd learned to navigate so skillfully. As Tommy continued his lecture about proper shooting techniques, completely oblivious to the irony of the situation, Maggie simply smiled and nodded, accepting his guidance with appropriate gratitude. The woman who had saved a general's life with one impossible shot listened patiently to shooting advice from a man who couldn't group his shots within 6 inches at 25 yards. The quiet hero had found her place again, hidden in plain sight, among those who would never recognize her true nature. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in revealing what you can do, but in choosing when to remain invisible. What incredible stories of hidden heroes have you encountered? Like this video if you believe in quiet courage. Subscribe for more amazing true stories, and let us know in the comments about the unsung heroes in your own life.